Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the mountains. Imagine the sound of boots sinking into black mud. It's a stench of gunpowder hanging over a creek where 3 men lay buried in shallow graves. It is September 1874, West Virginia. A child 12 years old emerges from the tree line dragging a rifle half his height. His clothes are torn, soaked in blood that is not his own. And when the sheriff demands to know what happened, the boy raises his head with eyes far older than his years and speaks 3 words that silence the air itself. They deserved worse. That child's name was Thomas Weaver. And what unfolded after that moment is not written in your school books. It is not whispered in tourist pamphlets or the glossy pages of Appalachian folklore. Note, this is a history bound in sealed files. Locked in courthouse basements, buried beneath the weight of coal dust and corporate silence, it is the story of how a single boy became both weapon and warning, a human fracture line in the foundation of America's industrial rise. But to understand him, you must abandon the comfort of what you think you know. You must walk deeper into the coal-scarred mountains, where company law ruled stronger than government, where death was currency, and where childhood could be burned away in a single night of blood. Because Thomas was not simply a boy with a gun, it was something else entirely, a mirror held up to the corruption of his age. A shadow born from the greed of men who believed they owned the land, the people, and the very air itself. Here's the part they never wanted you to hear. The men who died that night were not innocent travelers, not victims of random violence. They were agents and enforcers of the Consolidated Coal Company, a corporation so powerful it decided who ate who, starved, who lived, and who disappeared. And Thomas, whether guided by vengeance, by madness, or by something even darker, had struck the first blow in a war no one dared to name. Stay with me, because every word I'm about to reveal is a descent further into the forbidden. And once you hear it, truly hear it, too, will never look at history or at the hidden machinery of power the same way again. The world Thomas Weaver inherited was not built for innocence. By the 1870s, the Appalachian Hills were no longer mountains of freedom, but cages of industry. Coal companies carved into the land like predators, gutting their prey, swallowing forests, poisoning rivers, turning villages into debt prisons. And the law was nothing more than a mask stretched over corporate teeth. Understand this. The Consolidated Coal Company did not merely employ men, it owned them. Wages were paid not in money, but in script paper currency that could only be spent at the company's store, where prices were set to guarantee debt. Houses were rented from the company, shacks that leaned in the wind and rotted in the rain. Yet, the rent was automatically stolen from wages before a man ever touched his pay. Generations of freeborn Americans, men who once hunted, farmed, and fought for independence, were reduced to a kind of slavery without chains. And when the chains slipped, when voices rose, when courage gathered in the throats of hungry fathers, the company sent its shadows. The coal police. They had no uniforms, no badges, no allegiance too lonely to the paycheck and the taste of power. Former soldiers too broken for peace, drifters too ruthless for honest work, criminals who discovered a corporation's protection was stronger than any outlaw band. These men became judge, jury, and executioner. They decided who ate, who froze, who disappeared into the black hollows of the mines, never to be seen again. Think about that. Imagine living in a world where the sheriff could be bought, where the preacher's words bent to the company's will, where the store clerk who handed your wife flour could report your every complaint to men with guns. In such a world, silence was survival. Silence, like cold dust, seeps into the lungs and poisons a man slowly. And the Weavers, Thomas, his father Samuel, his brother Jacob, were drowning in it. What made Thomas dangerous was not just that he learned to shoot young, it was that he learned to see through the illusions adults still clung to. He saw that the company wasn't just stealing wages, it was stealing identities, bending men into obedient husks, controlling their minds through hunger, debt, and fear. He understood, far earlier than any child should, that power is not taken by the strong, but by those who are willing to use cruelty without hesitation. This is the crucible in which Thomas was forged, a boy raised not among playthings, but among weapons, debts, and betrayals. And soon he would give the mountains a lesson in what happens when a child learns the rules of the powerful and refuses to obey them. Samuel Weaver was not a weak man. At 38, his body was already breaking under Cole's punishment hands, knotted, lung-scarred, back bent from years crawling in tunnels designed to crush men into silence. But inside, he carried a soldier's discipline, forged in the Civil War when he marched with the 1st West Virginia Infantry. He had seen what unchecked power could do on a battlefield. He had seen how easy it was for men to vanish beneath the weight of orders and profit. And yet after the war, he hoped for peace. Just a small farm, a cabin, a place for his sons to inherit. The coal company stole that dream like it stole everything else. Jacob, 17, burned hotter than his father. Taller, stronger, restless with fury, he raged against the injustice that smothered them. He wanted to fight. He wanted blood. And yet Samuel, knowing the cruelty of the coal police, kept warning him. Violence was suicide. Resistance was a death sentence. Samuel carried silence like armor, but silence cannot protect forever. And then there was Thomas, small for his age, strange, unnervingly calm. Where Jacob blazed with anger, Thomas watched, calculated. His eyes seemed to strip the masks off men, reading their fears, their motives, their weaknesses. He had been raised less like a child and more like a weapon, sharpened by his grandfather Ezekiel, old frontiersman who taught him to track, to stalk, to shoot, to think like a predator. At 12, Thomas could kill cleanly, move invisibly, wait without blinking. He carried a Spencer repeating rifle, 7 rounds of steel thunder, more firepower than most grown men could handle. What disturbed people most wasn't that Thomas could pull the trigger. It was that he could do it without hesitation, without trembling, without the innocence of a boy. His mother had died giving birth to him. His father worked himself into dust. His brother dreamed of war, and Thomas learned to see the world without illusions. He didn't believe in fairness. He didn't believe in law. Believed in strength and the predator's rule. Understand what this means? A family pushed to the edge, Samuel drowning under debt. Jacob's defiance ready to ignite, and Thomas watching it all with the cold patience of a storm forming on the horizon. When men like this are trapped, cornered, stripped of every option, something ancient awakens. Violence becomes not just survival, but destiny. And destiny was already riding toward their cabin, cloaked in the black coats of the company's enforcers. It was evening when the sound came. Hoofbeats, deliberate and heavy, echoing down the narrow path that led to the Weaver cabin. Not the hurried gallop of neighbors in need, but the slow rhythm of predators arriving to collect their due. Samuel froze mid-sentence, Jacob's fists clenched instinctively. And Thomas just tilted his head as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Through the smudged glass of the window, Samuel saw 3 figures dismount. Knew them immediately. Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, James Crawford, the triumvirate of coal company terror. Men whose very names were whispered like curses across the mountains. Finch, the leader. A former Confederate cavalry officer with eyes like winter steel. Always dressed in a black suit that never seemed to gather dust, revolvers resting easy on his hips. His cruelty was deliberate, calculated, psychological. He didn't just kill men, he dismantled them first. Hutchinson, the brute, cowering, scarred with the smile of a man who had long ago learned to enjoy the screams of others. Violence wasn't a job for him, it was sport. And Crawford, its average height, thinning hair, unremarkable in every way. The kind of man you would forget in a crowd till the knife slid between your ribs. He killed without passion, without hesitation. With the calm precision of an accountant balancing a ledger, together, they were the company's silent message. Resistance is futile. They burned cabins. They dragged men into the woods. They erased names from payrolls and gravestones alike. No, they were here, at the Weaver cabin. Samuel's hand drifted to the knife at his belt. Jacob surged to his feet, fire in his eyes, but Thomas didn't move. He watched, measured. His young fingers traced the worn stock of the Spencer rifle resting against the wall. And in that stillness, you could feel it. The balance of fate tilting. The knock came 3 sharp raps that weren't a request, but a declaration. Finch's voice followed, cold, mocking, carrying through the thin wooden door. "Evening, Samuel. We hear you've been stirring trouble. Thought we might have a word." Every man in that cabin understood the truth. This wasn't a conversation. This was a death sentence, already written. But what none of them realized, not even Finch, with all his cunning, was that within these walls sat something far more dangerous than rebellion. A child who had already shed the weakness of childhood. A child about to show 3 killers that the mountains had birthed a predator of their own. The door opened not by choice, but by force. Finch's boot struck it wide, splinters flying. And the 3 Cole police stepped inside as though the cabin already belonged to them. Hutchinson's massive frame blocked the glow of the hearth, casting the room into shadow. Crawford closed the door behind them with quiet finality, like a man sealing a coffin. "Samuel," Finch said smoothly, his voice almost polite. "Seems you've been busy." Papers passed around, men whispering safety violations. That's not very neighborly. He walked slowly across the floor, his boots leaving streaks of mud on the worn planks. "You know, the company doesn't take kindly to that sort of disloyalty." Jacob couldn't hold himself back. He stood, fists clenched, his voice raw with rage. "You murder men for speaking the truth, and you dare call it loyalty." His youth made him reckless, and Finch's cold smile sharpened like a blade. "Careful, boy," the coal captain murmured. "Your tongue's too sharp for a future that's already hanging by a thread." Hutchinson chuckled, deep and guttural, and reached for his revolver, as if eager to make good on Finch's words. Samuel raised a hand to stop him, his voice breaking with the weight of desperation. "Leave my sons out of this. If there's blame, it's mine alone." That's when it happened. At the moment no one expected, not even Samuel. From the corner of the room, the metallic click of a lever echoed like thunder. All eyes turned.
Thomas
Stood there, his small frame rigid, the Spencer rifle pressed snug against his shoulder. The boy's dark eyes reflected the firelight, empty, steady, unblinking. "Leave," he said. Just one word, quiet but heavy enough to bend the air. Finch laughed. The others laughed with him. But the laughter ended the moment Thomas fired. The rifle's roar shattered the cabin's silence. Crawford fell first, the bullet tearing through his chest before he even drew his weapon. Hutchinson roared and lunged forward, but Thomas cycled the lever and fired again 2 shots. 3, 4, each one precise, each one merciless. The giant collapsed in a heap, blood soaking the floorboards. Finch staggered backward, eyes wide, disbelief painted across his face. A child had just slaughtered his men. He fumbled for his revolvers, but Thomas was faster. Another shot cracked and Finch stumbled out the door. Collapsing against the muddy banks of Elkhorn Creek, the water carried his blood downstream as Thomas stepped forward. Calm as if he had simply finished a chore. His father stood frozen. Jacob's mouth hung open. But Thomas only whispered the words that would echo through the mountains for decades. They deserved worse. By dawn, the bodies were gone. Officially, the men had disappeared. Unofficially, they were buried shallow along the banks of Elkhorn Creek, mud and water already working to erase the crime. Sheriff Thornton himself ordered the files sealed, stamping the case with a single line, "Matter resolved by mutual agreement," a phrase that meant nothing and everything. Understand what that meant. 3 armed agents of the most powerful corporation in West Virginia had been cut down by a child, and instead of unleashing fury, the system folded in silence. Why? Because the coal company didn't want weakness exposed. They couldn't admit that their enforcers, their shadow law, had been humbled by a boy. So they did what all powerful institutions do when their lies are threatened. They buried it. They pretended it never happened. But whispers spread. Miners who stumbled upon the creek bank told stories in hushed tones. Men spoke of a child with eyes too cold for his age, a boy who handled a repeating rifle with inhuman calm. Whispered that maybe he wasn't a boy at all, but something the mountains had birthed to defend themselves. A revenant, a curse, an omen. Tears. Forbidden truth. This was no accident. It was initiation, ritual written not in scripture but in blood. Thomas Weaver was no longer simply a son or a brother. In killing those men, he crossed a threshold most grown men never dared approach. He had glimpsed the machinery of power. Way fear controls men, the way silence enslaves them, and instead of submitting, he struck. But that act carved something out of him. Look at the details. No trembling hands, no tears, no stammering explanations. Just steady, deliberate violence. A boy's heart should have broken. Instead, it hardened into stone. This was not the end of Thomas Weaver. It was the beginning of a transformation that terrified even those who loved him. Samuel couldn't speak of it. Jacob refused to. But Thomas spoke only once, repeating the words that would brand him forever. They deserved worse. And in that phrase was more than vengeance. It was revelation. It was the echo of something men across centuries have felt when staring into the abyss of power, that justice is not given, it is taken. Sometimes it must be taken by hands too small to be forgiven. Fear spreads faster than fire. Within weeks, the story of Elkhorn Creek traveled through the mountains, carried on the lips of men who swore they'd seen the bodies, who claimed they'd spoken to the boy himself, who whispered that the Weaver child was more beast than human. In bunkhouses lit by oil lamps, over meager dinners of beans and cornbread, men lowered their voices and said his name like a warning. Thomas Weaver. Some claimed he could move through the forest without sound, that he shot with the precision of 10 men, that he was protected by something older than the coal company, something that walked these mountains before men ever struck the first vein of coal. Others swore they'd seen his eyes and said they weren't the eyes of a child at all, but the eyes of judgment itself. And here's what you must understand. In a world where miners were crushed by debt, starved by inflated prices, and beaten into silence, the idea of Thomas Weaver became more dangerous than any weapon. He was proof that resistance was possible. Proof that even the most feared coal police could bleed. That legend burned hotter than gunpowder, and the company knew it. So what did they do? They buried the files. They forbade newspapers from printing a single word. They ordered silence from the pulpit, silence from the sheriff, silence from every tongue they controlled. But silence doesn't erase. Fear, it amplifies it. The absence of truth becomes its own kind of evidence, and in that void, stories mutate into prophecy. Men began to believe Thomas Weaver was more than human. Women warned their children not to speak his name too loudly at night. And yet, miners facing the black maw of the tunnels each morning felt a strange flicker of defiance. When they remembered him, if a boy could fight back, why couldn't they? That was the real danger, not the bullets, not the blood, but the idea. Thomas Weaver had escaped the company's greatest weapon, psychological control. He was no longer just a boy, he was a symbol. And symbols cannot be killed with bullets, they spread. They multiply. They transform the minds of men. When power is threatened, it does not retreat, it adapts. The Consolidated Coal Company could not afford to let Thomas Weaver become a saint of rebellion. They understood something most men still deny. Control is never only about guns and money. It is about perception. It is about shaping the human mind until submission feels natural. So the company moved in silence. It didn't send new enforcers to hunt Thomas. That would only feed the myth. Instead, they turned their attention to the population itself. Rumors were planted. Paid informants whispered that the Weaver boy was possessed, that he had made a pact with the devil, that his rifle was cursed. In the company's version, Thomas wasn't a hero. He was an omen of destruction, spirit that brought death to anyone who stood near him. To admire him, they suggested, was to invite damnation. Preachers in company-built churches delivered sermons laced with warnings. Rebellion, they thundered from the pulpit, is the language of hell itself. And though they never named him, everyone knew who they meant. Children were told that disobedience would draw the Weaver curse. Mothers prayed their sons would never take his path. The company turned him into a specter, hoping fear of damnation would erase the spark of courage he'd ignited. But their control ran deeper still. In the payroll offices, debts mysteriously grew larger for families who had whispered Thomas's name too often. Men who voiced admiration found themselves suddenly blacklisted, evicted, cut off from the company store. Hunger is a sharper blade than any knife, and the company wielded it with precision. They didn't need to kill every rebel on. They starved the courage out of the rest. Do you see the pattern? It was never about coal. The coal was only fuel. It's the real resource. The true mine was human obedience. They extracted it daily, carving compliance from men's souls the way they carved black rock from the mountains. But here lies the danger they could not calculate. Suppression only makes legends stronger. Every attempt to demonize Thomas Weaver only confirmed the truth miners already felt in their bones, that he was dangerous. Yes, but dangerous to the right people. And half a century before corporations learned the language of propaganda, the coal company had already discovered its most powerful weapon, not bullets, not whips, but fear injected directly into the human mind. The mountains remember, and so did Thomas Weaver. In the weeks after Elkhorn Creek, he withdrew from what little childhood he had left. Neighbors said he wandered the forests alone, vanishing for days, returning silent, rifle always within reach. His father tried to speak to him, but Samuel's words carried the weight of a man still chained to hope. Thomas had already crossed beyond hope. Understand this. A child is not supposed to see the world so clearly. Most boys cling to illusions that fathers are unbreakable, that justice exists, that authority protects. Thomas had those illusions ripped away before his voice had even deepened. What remained was something raw, stripped down, elemental. He studied men the way a hunter studies prey. He watched for weakness, hesitation in the eyes, fear in the shoulders, doubt in the hands. He noticed how the coal police fed on silence, how the company thrived on obedience. And he understood instinctively that men who control others do so not because they are stronger, but because they are willing to use cruelty without hesitation. Thomas had learned the same lesson, and it haunted him. Witnesses set his eyes, unsettled them, not because they were angry, but because they were calm. A boy who had killed 3 men and felt no tremor in his voice. A boy who whispered they deserved worse, not with fury, but with certainty. That certainty was what frightened them. It wasn't vengeance anymore, it was revelation. And revelation is dangerous. He no longer fit the mold of son, or brother, or child. He had become a mirror of the system that had forged him. Where the coal company used fear to enslave Thomas, used fear to liberate or to destroy, where they erased truth with silence, he carved truth with bullets. He was becoming the very thing the mountains demanded, a predator in a land of predators. But there was something darker still. Killing once might be necessity. Killing twice might be survival. But when a boy kills without hesitation, when he begins to carry death the way others carry tools, you must ask yourself, what is being born inside him? Thomas Weaver was no longer simply a boy who defied a corporation. He was a child remade by violence into something the human mind struggles to define. Not hero, not monster, something older, something inevitable. Thomas Weaver did not vanish. He dissolved. He bled into the soil, into the rumors, into the marrow of the mountains. Men swore they saw him years later watching from the tree line, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes fixed on the company men. Others said he never grew old, that he was bound to these hills the way coal itself is bound waiting to be unearthed when needed. But the forbidden truth is this: Thomas Weaver was never just one boy. He was a reflection, a mirror turned toward us. What do you see when you stare long enough into corruption? Some men break, some men surrender. But some rare, dangerous become predators, shaped by the very cruelty meant to destroy them. The coal company understood. That's why they buried the files. That's why they sealed the story. Not to erase him, but to erase what he represented. The possibility that a child, stripped of illusions, could see the machinery of control more clearly than any adult, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Understand the weight of that. The coal barons used fear as currency. They starved, blacklisted, and broke men until obedience became instinct. That system did not die in the Appalachian hollows. It metastasized. It learned new languages, contracts, screens, numbers, data, but the essence is the same. They do not mine coal anymore. They mine compliance. And Thomas Weaver's story is not history yet, it's prophecy. It warns us that when the machinery of power grows to brazen, when lies replace air itself, someone will emerge who sees through the veil. Someone small, someone dismissed, someone unexpected. And that someone will remind the world that symbols are stronger than weapons, and that predators are born wherever predators are needed. You will not find Thomas Weaver's grave. You will not find his name etched into any stone. But if you listen closely, if you stand still in the Appalachian dark, you may hear him. The click of a lever, a hush of water over stone, the echo of a boy's voice saying the words that still curdled blood more than a century later. They deserved worse.